There's a moment in every HR leader's career where you realize rewards aren't just rewards, they're power. And when those systems feel opaque or unfair, trust crumbles fast.
I think it's really revealed how much employees mistrust the system, and that trust is not innate necessarily in compensation, and that
Shape who stays, who goes, and how people feel about what they're worth.
I don't think your total rewards can be bulletproof today.
What you can't see is hard to trust.
What I have learned along my 10 or 15 year journey through total rewards is that
there's a moment in every HR's career where you realize rewards aren't just rewards, they're power. They shape who stays, who goes, and how people feel about what they're worth. And when those systems feel opaque or unfair, trust crumbles really fast. Today's guest knows that better than most. Welcome to What the FDE, the podcast for HR leaders who are done playing defense and ready to shape the future of work. I'm Maya Bellay, and in this episode, I sit down with Katy Hoszka, Global Total Rewards Leader at Certn, and the kind of person you call when you're deep in complexity and need a path forward. I know I've personally called Katy multiple times for some help when I'm in some deep pickles. She's built pay structures from scratch, simplified the hell out of bloated frameworks, and helped exec teams face the hard truths about what fairness actually looks like. In this conversation, we get honest about pay transparency, salary bands as art, not science, and why reward strategy is just as much about storytelling as spreadsheets. And Katy does this better than anyone I know. Welcome to the show, Katy.
Oh, Maya, you're so kind. Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you. To kick us off, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself so that we know the real Katy before we jump into everything?
Yeah, sure thing. So I started out my career mainly doing payroll and benefits. Did that for a number of years before moving on to a tech company that was just starting up in Toronto. I came in as their second HR hire, initially on the payroll and benefits side. And in my 6-year journey there, I had such a really cool experience where I got to build all of our foundational people programs from the ground up, which along the way also included building our first set of salary bands. And that's how I kind of transitioned more so into total rewards. And today I find myself at the helm, I guess, of Certn, running our global compensation and benefits programs here. And I've been here now for just over 2 years and really loving it and love this team and super lucky to get to work with you every day, which I want to kind of throw it back to you. I've heard you host a number of these podcasts now, but I haven't actually heard an intro from you about your career journey. So could we just throw it back to you for a second and hear that bit?
Yes, of course. Would love to. So I've been at Certn just over 5 years now. I started at Certn in our customer support team, and then I moved on to our CS and sales team, and then quickly into HR. So it's kind of an interesting, unique perspective. Of course, I'm still an employee, but having that employee lens and understanding like the impact of what it feels like, and then also transitioning into leading lots of those programs. And so having that kind of unique lens of being in different areas of the business, while also shaping and leading some programs that now impact the whole business.
Yeah, I do think that your experience is really unique, right? And that you're always kind of bringing the balance of like, what do employees want and need and expect, and balancing that with the business. So it's always such a pleasure getting to work with you every day. And I've learned so much from you.
Thank you very much. But the pleasure is truly mine. So I'm very excited. So the first question I have for you, Katy, is I'm curious, as an employee yourself and in your experience, in the workforce, what has been the most meaningful kind of reward, perk, or benefit that you've felt on like a personal level?
It's kind of funny because in my role, I've often been the one who's like designing them and pitching them to executive teams. So it never feels like much of a surprise at the time when we go live with them, because it's been like weeks or months of effort going into it. But I would say there was truly one time in my career where I was really surprised and delighted. I worked at a staffing agency early in my career, and I was doing payroll and benefits at the time. And at that company, they really valued tenure, and they really wanted you to kind of be like the lifer at the company is who they really held highly there. And so it was the company's 30th anniversary, and I guess they were doing very well. And so financially, they decided to award us with spot bonuses. And so for every year you'd been at the company, you got a fixed amount of money. So there were some employees at this company who had been there for 30 years. And so they found themselves getting like a very nice surprise bonus that they weren't expecting. I got a nice surprise bonus that I absolutely wasn't expecting either. And I think just like that surprise and delight and kind of reinforcement now, when I look back on it, is like, oh yeah, here's something that they did for their employees that wasn't expected, but they tied it into their company value of tenure and like being there for a long time. And so now looking back, I find that like a very clever reward that they had done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that like that intentionality is what I'm really hearing around it, is ensuring the different pieces are connected. I'd say there's definitely an argument these days that some organizations aren't looking for long tenure. And so that, of course, might not make sense. But if that is the case and you are looking to keep people for a very long time at an organization, then how are you aligning all your perks and benefits to that intention?
Totally. Yeah, exactly. I think you always got to keep like your overall strategy in mind, right? And they definitely had it there in that moment. And that's kind of been something that's followed me in my career now, is like, what is our strategy and how are we building programs or systems around that strategy to support it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this goes perfectly into my next question. What your take is on what a reward strategy says about business priorities?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Certn, we've got a lot of lofty goals here that we're trying to meet as a business. And to go along with that, we've got really high performance expectations. And so we're really trying to double click on that high performance culture and really think about how are we rewarding our top performing employees. To support that, something that we launched new this year is we just started a top performer equity grant. So for those employees who had the highest performance rating, we gave them an outsized equity grant with a different vesting schedule to retain them for the long term, because we know our high performing employees are the ones that are going to get us to where we need to go. So we're always trying to think of ways in which we can keep them here at the business.
Wow, that is such a cool reward. And I'm curious, what inspired it, or kind of like, how did you come up with that?
So I think there was a few different things, right? We know that employees who were high performers through our engagement surveys, they were asking for recognition. And so they really wanted something that kind of set them apart from other employees. And then also we know equity programs, when they're well understood, I think that's a really key piece here, is the education with equity. But we know that they really are a great retention tool, right? They keep people staying at the company. They keep everyone motivated to work towards your goals and really become a successful company. And then also, frankly, it was really lack of budget. So I often find in my role, I'm not just at Certn, kind of at every company that I've worked at, right? I work at startups. We don't have a ton of money, or you need to be really savvy with your money. And so it's thinking about how do we maximize our rewards with a very set budget. And so something like a long-term incentive grant, it's not costing the company cash in the short term. And so that's an easy lever to pull with the executive team.
That's so cool and so ingenious, I think, too. Like around, I'm really hearing like widening the pie. It's like, we're constrained in one area, but can we do something else in another area that is going to be meaningful and impactful for employees ultimately? Kind of speaking around, the impact around those kind of pieces. I think a lot of people in HR and in people in culture have a challenge with this in general. Is like, how do you make the case? How do you make the business case for different pieces? I'm curious to understand from you, how do you demonstrate ROI of rewards at an executive level?
Oftentimes I find myself pitching to our CFO, like first our head of people and culture, and then ultimately you need the CFO to sign off. I feel like getting that executive buy-in from your head of people and culture, your CHRO, is usually pretty easy because they're already coming along the journey with you. And so now you need to bring your CFO on that journey and catch them up as well. An example that I can give you is you need to know like what your CFO wants, right? And they want to know what is the impact to the business. So like, what's the impact to our bottom dollar and what's the impact to employees? And like, that's the story that I'm often trying to talk about. So to go with my example, when I joined Certn, I looked at our total rewards that we had, and we have so many great perks and benefits here already. But I did see a gap in some of our offerings, and that we don't have a short-term disability program. And it's something that we're kind of managing internally, which can lead to a little bit of risk, right? You don't want to be collecting employee information especially like their medical information. And so I wanted to protect the business a little bit. So there was some risk mitigation there that I went to the CFO with. And then as a Canadian employee, I know about a Canadian benefit that the government offers. It's an EI rate reduction program. So for every dollar that an employee puts into employment insurance tax, your company matches 1.4 times. I'm going to get really geeky. Matches 1.4 times every dollar that the employee puts in. And so if you implement a short-term disability program at your company, you can actually reduce that 1.4x employer rate down a little bit by offsetting, because if you have an employee who needs to go on short-term disability, rather than going on government benefits, they'll be going on the employer-paid benefits. Then along with that as well, you need to return a portion of the savings back to employees. So the way I opted to do it is we went to our employee base and we asked them, we give you right now a $500 benefit. It shows up per pay. It's 20 some odd dollars. You're taxed on that 20 some odd dollars. It's probably not that impactful because you don't actually see that $20 as a separate line item, right? It gets mixed in with your net pay. Instead, we could introduce a health savings account or a health spending account, and then offset. Instead, we could give you a health spending account worth $550, which is tax-free money that you can get. And then that accounted for the portion of savings that we needed to return to employees because we took the benefit from $500 up to $550. And so I went to our CFO with this like great big plan, but at the top of the presentation, and actually this was because of you, thank you. I put right at the top of the plan, here's what the total savings actually work out to be. So despite adding a short-term disability program and increasing a benefit to employees, it actually netted out a savings. And so, that one obviously was a really easy one to get executive sponsorship on because we're saving the money while also enhancing employee experience. But that's kind of how I always lead with it, right? Is doing your cost analysis, knowing what the impact is going to be to the business, but also being able to explain it to the impact to employees. And that risk mitigation as well for now not collecting medical information on our employees. It was just an easy business case to say yes to. So that's something I'd always recommend to double down on, right? Come with your facts. Hopefully you can mitigate some of your costs or your risk, and then you should get some easier buy-in from your exec team.
This is such a good example, Katy. And I remember reading through this proposal and I was just so incredibly impressed with how thoughtful it was and intentional. You went through every different piece, like all stakeholders were considered in this, and there was wins all around. And it wasn't, I know you've just laid it out quite clearly, and it seems like it was a very no-brainer, easy kind of situation, but this was like very intricate, very thought out. You were just really kind of squeezing the lemon in a way to make it work for the business. And I was so impressed. But it was such a huge benefit. And I think we've seen like such a huge increase in spending on the HSA where people now are like, wow, this is a really cool benefit that we get in addition to our benefits to kind of top up that 80%. Whereas the $500 that we received on paychecks, like no one almost knew we even had that benefit. Like it's like not very meaningful, not very timely. It wasn't tied to anything. And so when we're able to kind of like switch that around, and then in addition for people on our HSA, like employees being able to have a great experience and going through a formal program is better for the employee, is better for the business, is better for everyone involved.
Totally. Yeah. And I think like the really interesting part here is kind of what you called out there is the perception of benefits as well, right? A $500 thing that shows up on every pay, $20 per pay, it's not that impactful. But when you get that $550 HSA and you can see the tangible effect that it has, and now increasing your benefit coverage, say from 80% up to 100%, it doesn't cost the business a whole lot more, but the perception of it is so different, which is really cool.
Yeah, no, I didn't even call that out. Didn't even hear that when I was going through, but you're right. It is the perception. Yeah, which is the kind of the most important thing, which is what you're measuring at the end of the day. So I'm curious to know, what has pay transparency revealed inside your organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is probably another area where I'm going to geek out a little bit because when I joined Certain, the mandate was, this British Columbia Pay Transparency Act is coming into effect in a couple of months. And like, what are we doing? How are we doing it? We need you to help like lead the way on this. So it was a really interesting and cool opportunity that I had in getting us ready for it. But I think what it really highlighted was like, there's a few things, right? Not every team had the same approach already to pay across the company. Like some teams, they had a lot of transparency. Some teams had absolutely no transparency. Like I think some people didn't even know what their salary bands were, or maybe their band, but not the one above their own. So just I guess, the inequitable approach that had happened over there not being a standard approach when I had joined. And then also, once we launched pay transparency, I could see that there was a lot of mistrust with pay transparency and so many questions that came along with it. They were great questions and fair questions. But I feel like, once you kind of open the curtains a little bit, people, they had a lot of uncertainties, I guess, as to, are we doing this properly? Am I truly being paid to market? Like they really wanted to know all of the details. So that part was really an interesting journey for me.
Yeah, it sounds eye-opening. And it's one of those tricky things, like sometimes a fish in water is like recognizing that it's your world and it makes sense. And then sometimes being out of that, it's like, oh yeah, there's all these questions that are coming up and sometimes unexpectedly. But I'm curious, where do you think the some of that mistrust, like where do you think that stems from for pay transparency?
Yeah, I think it's very complex, right? I mean, if I went and looked up a software engineer salary, I could find a slew of different salary bands that are posted, right? Because now a lot of companies, they are getting on board with it, or governments are mandating that they have to get on board. And so I think firstly, like a lot of mistrust comes from just how much varying information there is in the market. And I mean, you don't you can maybe see the salary band, but you don't know what that salary band is made up of, right? Like, is that company targeting, say, the 25th percentile of salary, meaning that they're not really at market, they're below market, maybe because they offset that with really great equity grants or really great benefits? Are they at the middle of market, or are they leading the market, right? Someone like a Google, for example, right? That's the easy one to talk about. If a software engineer at Certn was looking at a Google salary band compared to their own, they would feel like they were being mispaid, right? They would feel undervalued compared to market. So I think like that's the hardest myth to bust with employees is there's just so much more than meets the eye when you're looking at other postings, because you don't know unless they talk about it publicly. You don't know another company's compensation philosophy. And then I also think mistrust comes a lot from like leadership not being informed, right? So if you have a leader who doesn't understand pay transparency themselves, how are they going to make their teams feel like they're the subject matter expert, or like they feel that they're placed fairly in their band and can explain that to their employee? So there's just so many different facets of it that in order for it to really be a well-oiled machine and build trust, there has to be so many touch points along the way of like communication and training and shared understanding.
Yeah, I really like what you're kind of what I'm hearing is like it's not an apples to apples comparison. And we get that a lot, and I have lots of conversations with leaders across the business. And I mean it gets even more complex when you're talking about global geographies as well, where it's like, well, I've looked up this salary, like this has gone up by 20%, or like I can see so many jobs that are posted with these salaries, and having to, and the great part is there's a huge education piece in this where we have to kind of reinforce that same message around understand that that's what you're seeing, by Google searching or chat GPTing a salary for X role. But the reality is that if it was just that easy to do, we wouldn't need global total rewards, people who do this and live and breathe it all the time, because it would be that simple. But it's not that simple as the reality is, because there's a huge method to your madness around these huge sheets around creating fair and equitable compensation bands and placing them to market and in line with our comp philosophy rather than all of the other organizations out there. So it does get so complex and challenging, and you do have to kind of reiterate that message frequently and ensure that everyone understands it really well, especially leaders who are the ones who are kind of championing it with employees a lot of the time. And another thing that I found in my experience as well, is like when we were rolling out pay transparency, was some of those like generational differences in perceptions around pay transparency. And I know previously this wasn't that popular, and it was kind of taboo to talk about. It has been taboo to talk about your salary. And these days, people are talking openly about their salary and sharing it with their peers. And so there's just been such a huge shift in how people are talking about things. And the younger generation is also expecting pay transparency, and that being the norm and it being like very obvious for them. But then sometimes people who are more in decision making, people in leadership roles, are sometimes like from a different generation, and where that can also like having to tie those two pieces to make the case and understand why we're matching. There's definitely some generational differences at play, where lots of employees and folks who are joining our workforce these days are expecting pay transparency, even though people who've been in the workforce for a while sometimes feel like it's taboo. And so kind of connecting those dots or bridging that gap can also be challenging, and something I've found in lots of my conversations around pay transparency. Is it something that you've found yourself, or is that resonating at all?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is like the typical like HR P&C conundrum, right? Is like it's so hard to find the one size fits all across, different backgrounds, cultures, geographies, everything like that. And pay transparency was no different, right? There were some people who were adamantly against it and really were not happy that we were doing it. And there were some people who were like, well, finally, what took you so long, right? This is table stakes now. So you're definitely right. And, it's an interesting point as well about the generational differences is I think also when we talk about like mistrust in compensation is like in my career, leaders I've worked for, they've been an older generation where they didn't believe in transparency. And I can think back to a company that I worked at, and our CEO, he said to us all the time, he's like, guys, I will talk to you about just about anything, but I will not talk to you about compensation. So this is a company where we had pretty radical transparency, except for compensation, right? And so it was always like this black box that no one was allowed to see into. And so when there's this black box, you're like, I don't trust this at all. Like, if you're not letting us see it, what are you hiding, right? And I think people can go to like kind of that far edge of complete mistrust. And so getting those executives with those perspectives to realize this new generation that's coming in who expect transparency. And it's not like a nice to have, right? They're kind of demanding it. And I think rightfully so. Like, why is it this black box? I don't understand. Maybe it's a black box if you've not done it well, and hopefully that's not the case for any of our listeners. But I mean, legislation is coming, right? And they're going to be pushing pay transparency laws more and more. And I think pretty soon, if you're one of the employers who isn't on that pay transparency train, you're going to be getting left behind, right? And you're not going to be the employer of choice because younger generations are going to be like, I don't want to work for that company that's not talking about this stuff. Like, I want to work for the company who's more open about it and more progressive in this area.
Yeah, that's such a good analogy. And just, if what you can't see is hard to trust sometimes. So that little black box is like, yeah, what are you hiding? Because I think that's where our brain kind of defaults to. It's like, if you're not telling me, it's probably because you're hiding something, even though that's not necessarily the case, So
Definitely.
It's such a fascinating one. I'm curious, has your like being in total rewards and kind of understanding this place, I'm curious, being in the total rewards space for a long time, I'm curious, how has that impacted your view on fairness?
If you asked me 10 or 15 years ago what fairness meant, I would probably say fairness meant equality, right? It's like treating people the same, giving people the same opportunities and maybe the same benefits, maybe even the same compensation, right? So I think what I have learned along my, 10 or 15 year journey through total rewards is that equality and equity are two very different things. And I think like it was very idealist of me at the time to think like, yes, fairness means the same. And fairness does not mean the same, right? I think now we all know that, and it's nothing groundbreaking. But if you're focusing on having the same for everyone, how do you differentiate, right? How are you driving performance with your employees if they're going to be making the same as their employees who are not driving high performance? And so I think that's where the equity piece comes in, is that if it's in your compensation philosophy or your strategy that you're going to reward top performance, you've got to take the equality piece right off of the table, right? Maybe you can start people at the same place, but you've got to see advancement for impact and reward. And so that's something we've really been focusing on, right? Is how do we drive that top performance? And not just in terms of the equity grant that we talked about at the top of this, but like what extra stuff can we really do or give to our employees to help retain them? And I think, when we're talking about retaining our employees, it's not just those cash incentives or long-term cash incentives, right? I think like Maya, you and I have talked about this so much, right? You're not always staying somewhere just for a salary, right? It's kind of like the full picture. And what do you love about your work? And like, what brings you to work every day? Most days, it probably is your salary. I mean, I think if all of us won the lottery, I don't know if we'd all keep our jobs the same, right? Like, that's just the reality of it. But like, what brings us back to work every day? It's doing really great work, right? It's being proud of work that you do. It's driving impact. It's working with a team that's high trust and high support of each other. And so I think there's so many different levers that we can look at, not just within compensation, like from a total rewards or whole employee view. That is also just such an important element that often gets like overlooked.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, kind of to flip a question that I had earlier, I'm curious to know, what is one of the hardest truths that you've learned about how rewards actually work inside an organization?
It's balancing. Everything in total rewards is such a balance, right? Like and within HR, we have to balance the needs of the business with needs of the employees. And there's times where, you have to prioritize the business and times where you're going to prioritize employees. And I think that's one of the hardest truths, right? Within total rewards is, I think, maintaining that balance, because employees, they might expect like, oh, I know I've knocked it out of the park and inflation was like this % this year. And so that means I've got to be set up for like a massive increase because I'm keeping up with inflation. Plus I'm getting an increase for the work that I've done. And then the other side of it is the pressure, right? That the business feels pressure from inflation as well. And so how do you still give meaningful rewards and trying to meet employee expectations, especially within like this tech startup world? I think that's really tricky to balance. And the reality is that we have budgets that we have to stick to. And I don't always think like employees are necessarily aware of how that budgeting process works, probably because it's also another one of those black boxes, right? That we just don't typically talk about. And so I think like that's where expectations and reality don't always align.
It's so fascinating because it totally makes sense to me when you say that. It's so interesting when you say that, Katy, because it's a conversation we've had numerous times. And I think I see it all over LinkedIn. I see it, in conversations with friends and in peers in different groups. And often we have employees asking about inflation and how is that really impacting my salary, and why was my salary increase not as much as inflation was this year? And I'm curious to kind of put it back to you, like, how do you answer that for people? What that classic question around like, why is my pay not in line with inflation, or why am I not getting a bigger raise?
Yeah. So I think like mostly it comes back to like the budgeting side, but I also think like it really tries back to like, what is your compensation strategy, right? And I mean, at Certn, our strategy is that we're going to pay to market, and market does not directly correlate with inflation, right? So inflation, it has an impact because it's one of the pieces of input to compensation market data, but it's not the sole driver of it. And so I think like, when I think of inflation increases, I often think of like government, right? Where it's like you don't really have the upside of getting like big increases like you do within tech, or outsized equity grants like you get. So the inflation stuff is kind of like your safety approach, your safe approach to compensation. Whereas instead what I talk about with employees is, no, we're paying to market. And so if inflation's gone up 7%, but market has gone up 3%, then we're really only looking at that 3%, because at the end of the day, what we're comparing your salary to are other roles in that market that you have, right? So if customer success manager, for example, it's gone up 3%, we can safely rely that other customer success managers are also going up 3% if they're based on market data. And so we're still paying you competitively, which is the pillar of our compensation philosophy. And so that's all like, not what we fall back on, but like that's what we've built our structure around. And so that's where like the stance that we have taken.
Yeah. And I mean, often inflation will find itself reflected in market data eventually. So, kind of building off talking about our compensation philosophy, how do you like what is your take on location-based pay? A little bit of a hot topic.
That is a hot topic. Yeah. I mean, again, I think I would drive it back to like the business strategy, right? And also what is your company's philosophy on another hot topic, return to office, right? So at Certn, I mean, we're a global remote company. And so at the way it works here, or at Certn, we are a global remote company. So what we've decided to do at Certn is we're not doing location-based pay. We use national averages here because we are willing to pay, if we hire a software engineer in Toronto or we hire them in Victoria, we have said that their pay remains the same because we also don't want that employee to be tied to their location, right? This is the value, this is the money that we're willing to pay for this role, regardless of where you live within Canada, for example. And so we're not tying you to that location. And therefore, it also doesn't mean that you get a pay increase or decrease if you choose to move within Canada because we're a remote company. But I think other companies now, if you've got in-office mandates and you expect your employees to all be within this metro, then I very much do think that location-based pay would make sense for you. So I'd really tie it back to, what is your take on that return to office hot topic as well?
So tackling a few hot topics at a time to get to what is your kind of stance on location-based pay.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, very cool, very fun. So a few pickles to unpack along the way. I'm curious to hear your take on how do you get board buy-in for bold reward decisions?
Again, I mean, similar theme here, right? I would again lead with what is your business strategy? So if I came to our CFO or our executive team or board and with some really outlandish idea that was just so far off base from like what we were trying to do, right? If I wanted to say, at Certn, we're driving a high performance culture, but I actually think, we should give everyone a 5% increase across the board next year, I would be kicked out of the room immediately, right? Because that just doesn't align with what our strategy is. So you've always got to lead with that. And that's your first check and balance. And then I think that boards really lean in when you can connect a bold decision directly to either growth of the business, growth of employees, retention, or risk mitigation, right? Kind of like I alluded to earlier as well. If you can come in and talk about something that's aligned to your strategy and those other pillars, you're already off to the races. And then also as a total rewards person who likes a good spreadsheet or a set of numbers, I also like to bring in the data as well, right? So if I can overlay data to back up anything and say, here's either a trend that's happening in the market or here's some market pricing that back up this decision or recommendation, that also gets you that buy-in. And then finally, I want to bring options instead of absolute. So I'm not coming with, here's the entire plan. You need to come in with some flexibilities, maybe an option A or B, because I do find that when you give that choice, and ideally two choices that you really like, or maybe one that you really like and really makes sense, and one that's not so great can also sometimes help get buy-in because they're like, option B was terrible, but option A was great. To tie it back as well, I would say that bold decisions does not have to. And then to tie it all together, I would say that bold decisions doesn't have to mean that they are reckless decisions, right? You can still make bold choices that are still rooted in your company's strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes it's those simple changes too, like simple new kind of recommendations that can have a bold impact. And sometimes it is like, a crazy new idea that we haven't tried before and we're wanting to lead and be really innovative with this new offering. And then sometimes it is just one of those kind of like, this makes sense for us right now, and we're going to offer this new perk. But really hearing that, bringing in that kind of framing around these are some of the different options, and so that you're containing, that decision within that space is such a good tip for anyone in any type of recommendation, whether it's here or in any other space in the business. Is super valuable.
I think also there, Maya, employees are generally quite okay with you not shipping a perfect product, right? And I don't think they always expect perfection either. So if you can take that iterative approach and do methodical changes and improvements over time that lead you to a better product. Because I also think like this is a question I've been seeing a lot lately is how do you future proof your total reward strategy? I don't think that you can, right? Like the workforce is changing so much. AI is changing things so much. So I don't think your total rewards can be bulletproof today. They have to be set up to be fluid and flexible. And I would really recommend everyone lean into that.
I love that. That's such a good nugget. It's really that kind of the idea around like continuous improvement and the way the work, like it feels like work has just exponentially changed over the past year in ways that I would have never envisioned. And so even a year ago, it's like, do you think we'd find ourselves here at where we do right now? Like, absolutely not. Not even a chance, not a little bit. And so kind of taking that approach with everything that we do and just kind of going with the flow and iterating as we go, ensuring that we're having in-time feedback and adjusting and continuously improving that process, because we can't, like the idea is an ideal idea of being proactive and being super ahead of the game and 3 steps ahead, but it just doesn't feel like it's a very realistic place that we can be these days. So one last question for you. If you had to write a comp philosophy on a Post-it note, what would it say?
Equitable, trust-driven, based in performance, and human. I mean human in the sense that AI is not building out our compensation framework or philosophy. It is very much driven by people and based off of feedback that we get from our employees. And I really want it to be something that resonates with our employees.
Yeah, I love that human-centered element at the outset, because it's impacting human lives, and ensuring that we keep the human element at the front of what we do is so important. And I love it. That's a fantastic close. So I just wanted to say a big thank you for such thoughtful and grounded conversation, Katy. If you want to see more of Katy's thinking on total rewards and people analytics, we've dropped her details in the show notes. And if this episode made you rethink how your own reward strategy is landing, you can sign up for our free insights at certn.co/podcast, curated for people leaders who want signal, not noise. That's certn.co/product for you. So thank you so much, Katy. Really appreciate you spending the time with us today. It's been such a pleasure.
Likewise, Maya. Thank you so much.